They said no woman crossed that desert alive. But I did. The year was 1876. The sun didn't shine, it punished. The desert stretched for miles, hot enough to melt your thoughts, dry enough to steal your soul. Nina McCalloway walked through it alone. Her lips were cracked, her feet bleeding, her eyes half blind from dust, but she kept walking, because stopping meant dying. Around her neck hung a small brass locket, her last memory of another life. Maybe it held a picture. Maybe it held a name. Either way, it was the only thing that still remembered who she used to be. She hadn't spoken to anyone in days. There was no one left to speak to. The desert didn't listen, and neither did people. When she finally reached Dust Haven, it wasn't much of a town, just a few wooden buildings leaning against the wind. The sign at the entrance read, "Welcome, stranger." She almost laughed. There was nothing welcoming about it. Men outside the saloon stopped talking when she walked by. Their eyes followed her like knives. "Pretty thing for a beggar," one of them muttered. "Trouble come walking," another said. She didn't reply. She didn't even look at them. Inside the general store, the air smelled of dust and disappointment. "I'm looking for work," she said, her voice weak but steady. The woman behind the counter eyed her coldly. "Ain't much call for strangers," she said. "You from the east?" Nina didn't answer. That silence was enough. "Try the saloon or the laundry," the woman added, "if you're not too proud." Nina turned and walked out without a word. The wind pushed against her dress, carrying bits of sand that stung her skin. By sundown, she had knocked on every door, and every door had closed in her face. She sat on the steps of the empty post office, her body aching, her hope nearly gone. The sky above her burned red, like the desert was still chasing her. For a long time, she just sat there, clutching her locket. She thought about the city she'd escaped, the man whose love left bruises, the night she ran without looking back. Everything she owned, everything she was, had been taken by someone else. Then she heard laughter. Rough, mean laughter. Two drunk men stumbled out of the saloon. One said, "Tell her old Whitlow up on the mountain needs a maid." The other chuckled, "Yeah, if she's desperate enough. Ain't no woman gone up there and come back sane." Their laughter faded into the wind. Nina lifted her head. Her eyes found the dark shape of the mountains rising above the town, tall, cold, and silent. She stood, brushed the dust off her skirt, and whispered to herself, "Then that's where I'll go." And as the last bit of sunlight died behind the ridge, she started walking, toward the man the town called the mountain ghost. They said no woman comes back sane from that mountain. Those words followed Nina as she climbed higher through the night. The wind howled, cold and sharp, cutting against her skin. The ground was rough, stones slipping under her feet, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Her legs trembled. Her throat burned. Every step hurt, but pain was nothing new to her. She'd already survived worse. The desert didn't break her. Dust Haven didn't scare her. This mountain wouldn't either. The trail twisted through dark trees. Branches tore at her dress, scratched her arms, left lines of blood on her skin. Still, she kept climbing. In the distance, something glowed, faint and golden, like a star that refused to die. It was a cabin. Her breath caught. For a second, she thought it might be a dream. But the smell of smoke was real. The flicker of firelight was real. She pushed through the last stretch of trees until she stood in front of it, small, sturdy, silent. Smoke curled from the chimney, floating up into the black sky. For the first time in days, hope didn't feel impossible. Nina raised her hand and knocked, once, twice. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might break her ribs. The door creaked open. And there he was, John Whitlow. A man carved by solitude. Broad shoulders, rough hands, a face marked by the kind of silence that keeps secrets. His eyes were cold at first glance, but behind them, something stirred, something she couldn't name. For a few seconds, neither said a word. The night between them was thick and heavy. Then Nina spoke, voice dry but steady. "I was told you need a maid," she said, "and I need shelter." He looked at her like he was trying to read a language long forgotten. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask why she was there. He just stood still, and then stepped aside. "Stay." That was all he said. Inside, the cabin was quiet and clean, a world built from wood, fire, and loneliness. The smell of pine and smoke filled the air. The fire burned low in the hearth, painting the walls orange. John handed her a tin cup of water. Nina drank too fast, coughing halfway, but he didn't laugh or scold her. He just waited until she caught her breath. "I can work," she said quickly. "Clean, cook, whatever you need." He nodded once. "Then stay." The words were simple, but something in his tone felt final, as if he wasn't used to saying much, but when he did, it meant everything. Nina sat by the fire, her hands trembling from exhaustion. She hadn't known warmth for so long, it almost scared her now. John went about his quiet work, not saying a word. When she finally lay down on a small cot, her body ached, but her mind refused to rest. She watched the firelight flicker across the ceiling, listened to the soft creak of the wooden floor. Somewhere behind her, he moved, slow, steady footsteps. Not loud, not threatening. Just there. Not anger. Not kindness. Something in between. Nina turned her face toward the faint light, her eyes half closed, and thought quietly, "What kind of man lives this far from mercy?" And before sleep took her, she knew one thing for sure. She'd found shelter, yes, but maybe she'd also stepped into a story she didn't yet understand. Sometimes silence tells you more than words ever could. Days slipped into weeks. Time on that mountain didn't move like it did anywhere else. Every morning began with the same quiet, the sound of wind through the trees, the creak of the cabin walls, and the steady rhythm of chores. Nina worked without being told. She cleaned, cooked, mended torn clothes. Her hands were always busy, because busy hands didn't have time to remember pain. John never asked her to do anything. He never told her what to do, but somehow he always noticed what she needed. When she carried heavy buckets of water, he fixed the path so her steps wouldn't slip. When she chopped wood, he silently took the axe from her and finished the job without a word. He spoke little, almost never. But his silence wasn't cruel. It was careful, like a man who had learned that words could break more than they could fix. At night, they shared the same space but lived in different worlds, she by the fire, he by the window. He'd sit there for hours, staring out into the dark, as if waiting for something that would never come. One evening, as rain clouds gathered in the distance, Nina began to hum, softly at first, just to fill the emptiness. It was a lullaby her mother used to sing when storms frightened her as a child. The sound was low, shaky, but it wrapped around the small cabin like warmth. She didn't know he was listening, not until she turned. John stood in the doorway, still as stone, his hands frozen mid-motion. The look on his face wasn't one she expected. It wasn't anger or irritation. It was something gentler, something that almost looked like remembering. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he looked away, clearing his throat. The next morning, when Nina came to the table, a small jar sat in the center. Inside it were a few wildflowers, purple, white, yellow, fresh from the mountain. No note. No words. Just flowers. Her chest tightened. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. Some things were too fragile for words. But peace never lasts long on a mountain like that. That afternoon, dark clouds began to crawl over the sky. The air changed, thick, restless. Nina looked out the window and saw the trees swaying, their leaves flashing silver in the wind. John came in from outside, his shirt damp, his expression sharp, almost wary. She'd never seen him like that. His eyes darted to the windows, then to the sky. And for the first time since she'd met him, she saw it. Fear. A single flash of lightning split the sky open, followed by thunder that shook the walls. The cabin shuddered under the wind, and the fire flickered low. Nina turned to look at him, her heart pounding, and realized, this man who feared nothing, feared the storm. That night, thunder wasn't the only thing shaking the cabin. The storm hit hard and sudden, wind howling through the trees, rain slamming against the roof like it was trying to break in. The fire in the hearth hissed and flickered, shadows jumping across the walls. Nina sat near the flames, her knees pulled close, arms wrapped around herself. Every crash of thunder made her flinch. She'd never liked storms. They reminded her too much of shouting voices, of doors slamming, of nights she couldn't forget. Lightning flashed again, white and violent, lighting up the small cabin for a second before plunging it back into darkness. She closed her eyes and pressed her hands over her ears. Then she heard footsteps. Slow. Heavy. John. He didn't speak. He just walked over, calm, as if the world outside wasn't tearing itself apart. He set a lantern down between them, its light soft, steady, golden. For a while, neither said anything. The storm roared outside, but inside there was only the sound of rain and breath. Nina finally whispered, "You don't mind me being here?" John looked at her, not long, not deeply, but enough to make her feel seen. "Mind the silence less when you're in it," he said quietly. She didn't know what to say. The words were simple, but something about them settled inside her, like warmth after a long cold. For the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't feel like an intruder. They sat that way for hours, two broken people sharing the same quiet space while the storm raged around them. When the thunder began to fade, Nina looked up. John's head had tilted slightly toward the light, his eyes closed. For the first time, his face didn't look hard or guarded. It looked tired and human. That night, she slept without nightmares. But in Dust Haven, peace never lasts long. By morning, the sky had cleared, and John saddled his horse. He didn't say where he was going, but she knew he was heading down to town for supplies. The hours dragged while he was gone. Nina cleaned, cooked, waited. When he finally came back, the light in his eyes had changed. His face was tight, his jaw set. Something was wrong. He walked past her, dropped his coat, and sat down heavily at the table. "They talk," he said finally, his voice low, rough. Nina froze. "Who?" "The town," he muttered. "They don't like that you're here. They say I keep you like a wife. They'll drive you off again, same as before." Her heart twisted, but she didn't look away. She stood there, calm, her voice steady. "Then let them try." John looked up, startled, maybe by her courage, maybe by how much he needed to hear it. Outside, the wind began to rise again, soft, but warning. And in that moment, both of them knew the real storm hadn't even begun. Sometimes the quietest towns have the loudest tongues. Dust Haven looked peaceful from the mountain, small, calm, harmless. But peace was a lie. In that town, words could burn faster than fire, and whispers traveled quicker than wind. It started small, one person saying, "He keeps her up there like a wife." Then another added, "She's got him under some kind of spell." By the end of the week, the whole town was talking. Every time John went down for supplies, he could feel it, the stares, the smirks, the silence that followed him like a shadow. People who used to nod at him now turned away. Even the store clerk looked nervous handing him change. He didn't say much about it, but Nina saw the difference. The quiet between them changed. It wasn't calm anymore, it was heavy. He worked longer hours, fixing fences that didn't need fixing, cutting more wood than a fire could ever burn. His silence, once steady and kind, now felt sharp, like something meant to protect her, but hurting her instead. Nina understood shame. She'd lived with it her whole life. So she didn't push him. She didn't question his distance. She just stayed. Because staying, when the world wanted you gone, was its own kind of courage. Days passed in silence. When he left for the forest, she cleaned the house till it shone. When he returned, she pretended not to notice how he avoided her eyes. That evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, Nina decided to do something small. Something human. Something kind. She baked bread. The smell filled the cabin, warm, sweet, soft. For a while, it felt like home again. When John came in, his hands rough from work, he paused. His eyes flicked toward the table, then to her. She said quietly, "It's fresh. You should eat." He sat down, broke a piece off the loaf, and took a bite. Then, without a word, he tore it in half and handed the other piece to her. They ate together in silence, not the cold kind, but the kind that says more than words ever could. Outside, a church bell rang in the distance. Its sound rolled up the mountain, hollow and strange, a warning wrapped in something that almost felt like a blessing. Nina looked toward the window, the fading light spilling across the floor. Somewhere deep down, she knew, peace was only pretending to stay. She thought courage would silence them. It didn't. Autumn came quietly. The leaves turned golden, the air grew sharp, and for a while, life on the mountain almost felt calm. Nina and John worked side by side, chopping wood, mending fences, sharing quiet meals. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them had grown softer. It almost felt like peace. Until the whispers came back. One afternoon, while Nina was hanging clothes to dry, she heard the sound of laughter and music drifting from the valley. She paused, tilting her head toward the wind. "It's the harvest festival," she said. John didn't even look up from his work. "I haven't gone in years." Nina hesitated, then said, "Maybe we should go this time." He glanced at her, eyebrows furrowing. "Why?" She took a breath. "Because hiding makes them right. Let them see us. Let them see we're not ashamed." He stared at her for a long moment, then finally nodded. "All right." By sunset, they were walking down the ridge together. The town below was glowing with lanterns and laughter. Music floated in the cool air, and for the first time in a long time, Nina felt almost brave. When they stepped into Dust Haven, the festival stopped. Completely. Conversations died mid-sentence. The fiddles went quiet. Dozens of eyes turned to them, sharp, judging, curious. Nina's heart pounded, but she didn't lower her gaze. John walked beside her, calm and steady. The crowd parted as they passed, but the whispers began to rise, low and poisonous. "There she is. The mountain woman. He keeps her up there like a wife. She bewitched him." Nina swallowed hard. Her fingers trembled. The warmth in her chest turned cold. Then a familiar voice cut through the noise. "Martha Claymore." "Well, look who finally came down from the mountain," Martha said loudly, fake sweetness dripping from every word. "The maid and her master." Laughter followed, small at first, then spreading like fire. Nina froze. Every whisper felt like a knife. Her cheeks burned, her throat tightened, but she refused to cry. Before she could speak, John moved. He stepped closer to her, eyes locked on Martha. The crowd went still. Then, without a single word, he reached for Nina's hand and placed it over his chest, right above his heart. The laughter stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the soft crackle of lanterns in the cool evening air. John's message was clear. "She belongs here. With me." Nina didn't move. She just looked up at him, her heart pounding for a different reason now. And for the first time since she came to Dust Haven, she felt no shame. They turned and walked away, leaving behind the stares, the whispers, the cruel smiles. The crowd didn't know what to say. For once, Dust Haven had nothing to gossip about. The road back up the ridge was quiet. The moon had risen, glowing faintly through the trees. Nina walked close beside John, her hand still tingling from where he'd held it. For a moment, it felt like the air was finally clear again. Then Nina stopped. Her nose twitched. Something sharp burned at the edge of the wind. "John," she whispered, "do you smell that?" He froze. The color drained from his face. Smoke. And as they looked up the mountain, the sky above their cabin glowed red, not from sunset, but from fire. By the time they saw the flames, it was already too late. The night sky was red, not from sunset, but from fire. The smell of smoke hit them before the heat did. Then came the roar, deep and alive, like the mountain itself was burning. John didn't hesitate. He broke into a run, boots pounding against the dirt, his voice sharp and urgent. "Stay back, Nina." But she didn't listen. She ran after him, her heart slamming in her chest. When they reached the clearing, her breath caught. The cabin, their home, was burning. Flames crawled up the walls, licking at the roof, sparks flying into the air like angry stars. The barn had already collapsed, and the fence was nothing but glowing ash. John grabbed a bucket and sprinted to the well, hauling up water with shaking hands. He threw it over the fire, but the flames only hissed louder. "Go!" he shouted. "Get down the ridge." Nina's answer came through coughs and smoke. "No. Not without you." She ran to the well, grabbed another bucket, and started throwing water beside him. Her arms ached, her lungs screamed, but she didn't stop. Every time she turned, a new wall of fire rose to take the place of the one they'd beaten down. "Damn it, Nina!" John yelled, trying to pull her back. She shook her head fiercely. "If this place burns, we burn together." A burning beam fell between them with a crash. The air filled with sparks. John pushed through the smoke, grabbed her hand, and dragged her clear. They stumbled into the open, both gasping, faces streaked with soot and sweat. The night was chaos, wind whipping the flames higher, trees exploding one by one. The heat was unbearable, the noise deafening. But they didn't stop. Again and again, they ran back, carrying water, beating at the fire with soaked blankets, refusing to give in. Each time Nina thought she couldn't go on, she looked at John, his jaw clenched, eyes fierce, body moving like a man who refused to lose one more thing in his life. And that gave her strength. Hours passed. Slowly, painfully, the fire began to die. The flames shrank to glowing embers. The smoke turned gray. And the night grew quiet again. By dawn, the mountain was still. The air was thick with ash. Half the cabin still stood, blackened, scarred, but standing. The other half was gone. John sank onto the front steps, his face streaked with soot, his hands trembling from exhaustion. Nina knelt beside him, coughing softly, her hair tangled and singed at the ends. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, John let out a low breath. His voice was rough, broken. "I built this place to keep the world out." He looked at the burned walls, the smoke curling into the pale sky. "And it came anyway." Nina stared at the cabin, the ruins, the ashes, the half that survived. And in the silence that followed, she reached out and took his hand. The world had tried to destroy them again. But once more, they were still standing. Sometimes destruction brings the only kind of peace worth having. When morning came, the world looked different. The air was still thick with smoke, but the fire was gone. The cabin stood half-burned, black scars on the walls, ashes scattered across the yard, yet somehow it was still there. Still alive. Just like them. Nina and John didn't waste time mourning what was lost. They picked up what they could save, every plank, every tool, every small piece that the fire hadn't stolen. Their hands were blistered, their clothes ruined, their faces streaked with soot, but there was a strange calm between them now. 4 days, they worked side by side in silence. Nina mended what she could inside, while John rebuilt what he could outside. When their hands hurt, they laughed softly and kept going. When their backs ached, they leaned against the porch steps and watched the sun sink behind the ridge. They didn't talk much about the fire. They didn't need to. Both of them knew it had taken something, but it had also given something back. A new beginning. A week later, when the cabin walls stood tall again, John saddled his horse. "I need supplies," he said quietly. Nina nodded, brushing the dirt from her skirt. "Be careful down there." The ride to Dust Haven was quiet, the trail still lined with fallen trees and blackened soil. When he reached the edge of town, people turned to look, but not the way they used to. This time, no one laughed. No one whispered behind his back. They'd heard about the fire, about how John Whitlow and that mountain woman had fought it all night, saving half the ridge from burning to the ground. The same people who once mocked him now stepped aside when he passed. The store clerk gave him a nod of respect. "Good to see you made it," he said. Even Martha Claymore, standing near the bakery, went quiet when she saw him. She didn't smile. She didn't sneer. She just looked down. John gathered nails, flour, cloth, and rope. Not a single word of gossip followed him this time. Just silence, heavy, but peaceful. When he finally turned his horse back toward the mountain, the air felt different. Lighter. Cleaner. By the time he reached the clearing, the sun was setting. Smoke still lingered faintly in the air, but it smelled less like fire, and more like healing. Nina was waiting by the creek, her hands washing the soot from an old pan. The sunlight caught in her hair, turning it gold. She looked up as he approached, smiling softly. "They're talking different now," she said. John dismounted, setting the supplies down. He gave a half-smile, the kind that carried both pride and disbelief. "Maybe they're done talking." Nina looked at him for a long moment, her eyes gentle but knowing. People like that never stop, she said quietly. He nodded once. I know. The mountain wind moved between them, quiet, calm, carrying the scent of pine and ash. For now, the world was silent. But they both knew, silence never lasts forever. They tried to burn them down, but love doesn't burn easy. The fire had taken almost everything, but not them. Weeks passed, and the mountain began to heal. Green slowly pushed through the ash, wildflowers blooming stubbornly where the fire had once raged. The air smelled of smoke and pine, a reminder of everything they'd survived. One evening, John and Nina sat beneath the scorched oak that still stood outside their cabin, its trunk blackened, but its branches alive again with small green leaves. The setting sun poured gold through the trees, and for the first time, the world around them felt still. John held something in his hands, a few wildflowers he'd gathered from the creek. His rough fingers worked slowly, carefully, braiding the thin stems together until they formed a small, uneven ring. Nina watched, a soft smile curving her lips. "What are you doing?" He looked up, eyes warm but serious. "Making it right." He held the ring out to her. "No preacher," he said quietly. "No papers. Just truth." Nina blinked back tears as he slipped the fragile ring of flowers onto her finger. "You're my home," he said. She smiled, her voice trembling. "And you're mine." For a long moment they just sat there, two people who had lost everything the world thought mattered, but somehow found the only thing that ever did. The wind moved gently through the clearing, carrying the scent of pine, fire, and wildflowers. It felt like a promise, one that would outlast gossip, fear, and time itself. Years later, people in Dust Haven still told their story. They said the mountain man and the woman from the desert built their life from ashes, that they'd turned ruin into peace, and shame into something like grace. Old Eli, the town storyteller, would always end it the same way. "I saw them once," he'd say, "walking down into town together. People moved aside to let them pass. Even Martha Claymore bowed her head that day." John tipped his hat, smiled that quiet smile of his, the one that carried both sorrow and pride. Then he turned to Nina, and they just kept walking. And on some nights, when the wind blew down from the mountains, people swore they could still smell smoke and wildflowers mixed together, the scent of something that refused to die. If you listened closely, they said, you could almost hear a woman's voice whispering through the leaves. Mercy never comes the way you expect it, but it always finds those who keep their doors open.